for coming to hear my presentation. I don't know if we're supposed to wait for anyone else to come or not.
It's up to you.
I'll just go ahead maybe.
There you go.
Sure. So my paper combines the study of biblical theological themes, literary analysis, word-level scrutiny, and just a bit of psychological reasoning. To look at God's acts of seeing in Genesis, we will focus only on the verb ra. And their theological significance, their role as literary pieces of puzzle, foreshadowing the greatest narrative of judgment and redemption in the history of the people of Israel. Just before I start, I want to say just a public thank you to Dr. Coakley, who is here in the room. He is the one who has inspired me to come to this moment. So thank you, Dr. Coakley. The main thesis of this present paper is twofold. First, we will argue that there are two main reasons for which God sees Ra at certain points in time as recorded in Genesis. To morally evaluate his creation, especially humans, either for a positive or negative outcome of judgment, and to show care to the afflicted in order to intervene in their situation in a redemptive manner. We will soon observe that God's seeing is always followed by God acting. In all Genesis narratives, God is never a passive seer. Second, we will argue that the instances in which God is recorded as seeing in the book of Genesis serve as literary foreshadowing pieces of puzzle that come together in the core of the Exodus narrative, the greatest narrative in the history of Israel that encompasses both God's evaluation and judgment over Egypt and God's care for the afflicted and redemptive intervention in their situation, manifested towards his people Israel. Plato described the sense of sight as the cause of the greatest blessing to us, for it is the human capacity of observation that gave birth to philosophical thinking, the chiefest blessing due to the eyes. Even today, science generally recognizes that the sense of sight is arguably the most important one, especially for acquiring information. Through seeing, our brains acquire more information than through any of the other senses. On the other hand, it is without doubt that the scriptures affirm God's omniscience. That is, he is never in need of acquiring new information. But if God is indeed omniscient, why is he then described in the scriptures, particularly in Genesis, to be seeing at different points in history? What does God's seeing communicate to us about God's character and his relationship with creation, and particularly with us? We would like to suggest that, first, God sees to evaluate the moral quality of his creation, especially humans, either for a positive or negative outcome of judgment. And second, that God sees the afflicted in order to intervene in their situation in a redemptive manner. Although in our initial study preceding the writing of this paper, we have traced the theological theme of God seeing throughout the whole Old Testament, in this particular paper we have chosen to focus only on the book of Genesis, because our study has shown that the theme of God seeing has an important meaning and purpose in the book of Genesis, unique amongst other Old Testament books, for which we will argue. The book of Genesis is essential for our study not only because it serves as a foundational beginning to the Pentateuch and the Old Testament in general, but also because it is the only book to contain the act of seeing as part of a name given to God. Ata El Rai, you are the God who sees me, or God of seeing, or El Roi, in Genesis 16:13. Even more, Genesis is par excellence a book of seeing in the Old Testament. The verb Ra appears 141 times in Genesis. The most mentions of Ra in the Old Testament books are in Genesis, seconded by the Psalms with 100 mentions of Ra. Genesis leads also among the books in the Old Testament having more than 10 chapters, when counting mentions per 1,000 words in a book, with 6.84 mentions of Ra per 1,000 words. The act of seeing is performed by God in Genesis in 8 great narratives that feature collective characters that are being seen by God and individual characters that are being seen by God. We will take a look at each one of them, first addressing those involving collective characters. The first narrative in which God is recorded to be seeing is the very story of creation in Genesis 1. Sutzcover observes the centrality of the lexeme of sight, as she calls it, namely, and God saw that X was good. which in Brueggemann's perspective is part of a bigger sequence in the form of a liturgy pattern of time that comments upon the good order of the created world under the serene rule of God. The only day not containing the Lexeme of sight is day number 2, but it is understood by implication that its created content has been seen by God and approved as good in the inclusive 131. And God saw all that he has made, and behold, it was very good. Genesis 1:31 comes as a conclusion of the sequence of the 6 days of creation. In regards to it, Humphreys makes an important observation and raises an even more important question. First, he knows that God seeing and decreeing that the creation was good is presented as God's judgment. It is good because God looks at it, judges it, and says it is good. This is an important observation because it links God's act of seeing with the evaluation of quality. God is evaluating the quality of his creation, whether good or bad. But even more important is the follow-up question Humphreys raises. God judges is good, and even very good, but by what scale of values? As readers, we are left to wonder about how it is good and to what purpose. In other words, like Humphreys, we are interested in finding out if the good in 131 is just a functional good, meaning everything turned out to be and work according to God's intention in creation, or could it also be a moral good, thus carrying a moral value as well? In our attempt to answer Humphreys' question as to how the creation was good, we believe that Genesis 1:31 becomes truly significant in light of its counterpart in 6:12. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. Only 6 chapters later, the author uses the same wording to create a sharp contrast between the good creation in chapter 1 and the corrupt creation in chapter 6. The mirroring of wording between the 2 verses also signals a mirroring of pattern between the narratives of creation and corruption. The core of Brueggemann's liturgy pattern of time in the creation narrative is God said, it was so, God saw, and the time factor of a passing day. If we are to take the same pattern and apply it to the corruption narrative, we might find that 6:5 has the same elements, just in reverse order. God saw, the man's evilness, the man's inclination of thought, and the time factor all the day. In other words, in both narratives there is a pattern of source action, speech in Genesis 1, thought in Genesis 6, external outcome, creation, life in Genesis 1, evilness, destruction in chapter 6, specifically described in 6:11 as violence, God judgment of seeing, which is common for both, and the time factor, day and all the day. If 131 is a conclusion of the creation narrative, 6:12 is a conclusion of the corruption narrative, both having a similar pattern of progress. It is clear and unambiguous that God's act of seeing in the corruption narrative carries a moral weight because, based on his evaluation of the evilness and violent behavior of his creation, God decrees punishment. Thus, if 6:12 mirrors 131 in wording and literary purpose, we can conclude that, in the creation narrative of Genesis 1, God's act of seeing evaluates not only the functional quality of his creation, but also its moral quality. In 131, his creation was good, because it was not yet contaminated by the evil who later defines the corruption narrative of Genesis 6. Moving on in Genesis, God's act of seeing as evaluating the moral quality of his creation manifests itself in 2 more mirroring instances, this time specifically targeting humans. First, not long after the flood, the Lord came down to see what the sons of man have built, referring to the Tower of Babel. The wording matches a rather similar situation in Genesis 18:21, where the Lord says, I will go down and I will see what they have done, referring to the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. Again, the idea of God seeing represents more than the simple observation, which would question his omniscience. It represents moral evaluation. As Sutzcover notes on Genesis 11, God sees them in the sense of checking on their deeds. An important argument, especially in light of Genesis 18, comes also from Lamentations 3:50, where shakav, to look down, and ra, to see, are used, although here the Lord is expected not to come down and see, but to look down from heaven and see. This reference in Lamentations is significant because, although in poetic language, it does signal a semantic difference between shakav, to look down, and ra, to see. The hallowed notes the different definitions. Shakav as observance, while ra has a larger, and I would say deeper spectrum of glosses, including to understand, to experience, to notice, to spy, to know, and so on. Thus, God's act of seeing in the stories of the Tower of Babel and of Sodom and Gomorrah does not serve for mere observance purposes. But the question of why God had to come down and see arises in light of his omniscience as God. One hypothesis in regards to Genesis 11 is described by Sarna as a subtle irony. Coming down to see communicates how high above God stands in his divinity compared to the human's best efforts of self-elevation. Another hypothesis is that God's "come, let us go down" is a literary response to the human's "come, let us bake bricks," in what Alter calls a linguistic game of mirrors. While we have found both hypotheses to be significant and of authentic value for our study, we have also stopped upon a rather interesting one, this time in light of Genesis 18, that we believe might carry meaning to Genesis 11 as well, especially because of the use of the plural in 11:7. We recognize that this idea necessitates further study. But Danforth, in his sermon in 1674, describes God's coming down to see in Genesis 18 to set an example unto civil judges, to take exact cognizance of the cause, and after accurate examination to proceed to sentence and judgment. Danforth continues to say, "He condescendeth after the manner of man to make proof and trial of the truth and weight of that horrid cry which came up to heaven against the filthy Sodomites." In other words, according to Danforth, God comes down to see in both instances in a collective plural manner in order to exemplify what he will later establish in Deuteronomy 19:15 as a law. A single witness shall not suffice against a person for any crime or for any wrong in connection with any offense that he has committed. Only the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses shall a charge be established. We have noticed how God's act of seeing in Genesis so far represents God's evaluation of the moral quality of his creation, whether good or evil, especially of humans. God's act of seeing describes him not as a distant God from his creation, but as an actively involved God into what happens with and inside his creation. There is an absolute moral code by which everything is seen, evaluated, and judged, and that code is defined by God. But while the object of God's seeing were collective characters so far, the next instances in which we can trace the theme of God's seeing in Genesis target individuals, describing a different purpose. The second major reason for which God sees in the book of Genesis and in the Old Testament in general is to express care for the afflicted with the intention of intervening in their situation in a redemptive manner. There are 4 individuals in Genesis who experience God's seeing: Noah, righteous in the midst of a corrupt generation; Hagar, running from Sarai's mistreatment; Leah, hated because of her barrenness; and Jacob, treated unjustly by Laban. All these individuals experience God's seeing of their situation of affliction and God's redemptive intervention as a consequence of his seeing. The act of seeing is significant in the narrative of Noah, being used no less than 11 times in Genesis 5-9. God has already introduced himself as seeing the corruption of his creation 2 times, before specifically mentioning that he has seen Noah's righteousness in 7:1. It is important to note the pattern of each of these 3 instances. God sees, God acts. God's seeing in 6:5 is coupled with God's action in 6:6 on the inside and 6:7 on the outside. On a side but significant note, this may be the first emotional reaction of God recorded in the scriptures. God introduces his heart with the emotion of grief, grieving himself because of the human he has created. God's seeing in 6:12 is coupled with God's action in 6:13. The third time God is mentioned to be seeing is 7:1, to which the same pattern of seeing, acting, is applied, although recorded in reverse order. Go into the ark. This is the action. Because you I have seen righteous to my face in this generation. This is the act of seeing. God is never a passive seer. His seeing is always followed by an action, and this pattern applies to the other three individuals mentioned. Because God sees Hagar, she is restored and receives divine promises. Because God sees Leah, he opens her womb and she bears a son. Because God sees Jacob, he makes him prosper. But all these three individuals are marked by a key word: affliction. In this way, Hagar acknowledges that God has seen her affliction. And God sees Leah's affliction and Jacob's affliction as well. It seems that the only exception in regards to affliction is Noah, who is seen by God not because of his affliction, but because of his righteousness. But if we consider God's words of comparison implying Noah's unique righteousness in his evil generation in 7:1, we would not be wrong in assuming that, as a solitary righteous man surrounded by moral corruption, Noah was in a posture of possibly enduring affliction as well. We could say the story of Noah bridges the two thematic aspects of God's seeing in Genesis. God evaluates moral quality for judgment, you I have seen righteous, and observing the afflicted, he intervenes in their situation in a redemptive manner. Go into the ark. Christian psychiatrist Carl Lehmann discusses the idea of receiving attunement through feeling seen. You feel seen. You feel heard. You feel that I care about you. He also notes how eye contact is a sign of one's relational availability, as well as the traumatic effect of feeling invisible due to lack of parental attention and care. The idea of God seeing, as observed in this section, surely affirms these relational principles. God sees not because he is in need of acquiring new information about us, but because we are the ones in need to feel seen. It is in an important way we understand that God cares. As we have seen so far, there are two major reasons for which God is described to be seeing in Genesis. First, God sees to evaluate the moral quality of his creation, especially humans, either for a positive or negative outcome of his judgment, as illustrated by the creation and corruption narratives and the narratives of the Tower of Babel and of Sodom and Gomorrah. Second, God sees the afflicted in order to intervene in their situation in a redemptive manner, as shown in the narratives of Noah, Hagar, Leah, and Jacob. But before we move forward, we should know that Hagar's narrative stands out among the others for at least two reasons. First, there are two intriguing namings that take place, unique in the scripture and the ancient Near Eastern literature culture, as Walke notes. Genesis 16:8 is the only known instance in ancient Near Eastern literature where the deity addresses a woman by name, while 16:13 represents the only instance in the Bible where a human being is represented as conferring a name on God. She is invested with a power attributed to no one else in the Bible. Hagar calls the name of the Lord who spoke to her. She does not invoke the Lord, she names the Lord. She calls the name, she does not call upon the name. Why is this significant? It is significant because the episode with Hagar in chapter 16 comes in the context of God's covenant with Abram just a chapter before, in Genesis 15. While God reveals himself to Abram to assure him that he will give him a son, Abram has doubts and needs yet another assurance. God invites him to see, Ra, the stars of the sky, and only after seeing, Abram believes. But compared to Abram, Hagar, the woman, servant, Egyptian, the outcast, the sinful and rejected, does not need extra confirmations to trust God's promises to her. While Abram needed to see in order to believe God's promises to him, Hagar believes God's promises to her as an assurance that God has seen her. Her naming of God derives from the fact that she receives divine guidance and feels God has seen her and keeps watch over her. Because for a woman who is denied a personal identity by those with whom she lives, the divine care she has been shown throughout the dialogue exceeds the human abandonment she had suffered. She defines God's care for her in declaring that God has seen her. Hagar gives God a name that expresses his special significance to her. She responds to the person, not to the promise. She no longer gloats that she is pregnant, but marvels at the Lord's care for her. But there is a second reason for which Hagar's story stands out. It puts together God's hearing with God's seeing, as expressions of God's care for the afflicted. The aspect of God hearing the cry of the afflicted anticipates also the cry God hears about Sodom and Gomorrah, while hearing and seeing go together again. Humphreys notes that in her apparent use of the form of the verb ra'ah, to see, Hagar reverses and intensifies the way Yahweh's messenger spoke of Yahweh's attention to her, described in language of hearing in 16:11. But the story of Hagar, the Egyptian slave, intertwining God's hearing and seeing of the afflicted, as significant as it is, foreshadows a much greater story, the greatest historical moment of affliction and redemption in the history of the people of Israel, the Exodus from Egypt. There are no less than 87 verses throughout the Old Testament that evoke the story of Exodus, specifically about God taking his people out of Egypt. No event in Israel's history is mentioned more times in the Old Testament than this. And so great is the impact of this event that it becomes a marker of identification for God before his people, in both self-identification, Exodus 20, verse 2, and identification by others, Judges 6:13, for example. Thus, the importance of the Exodus narrative in Israel's history cannot be emphasized enough. Brueggemann puts it this way: the Exodus recital, either as a simple declarative sentence enacting Israel's primal theological grammar or a fuller narrative, becomes paradigmatic for Israel's testimony about Yahweh. It becomes, moreover, an interpretive lens to guide, inform, and discipline Israel's utterances about many aspects of its life. We believe the choice of words in Genesis 16:11-13, intertwining God's seeing with his hearing in the story of Hagar, the Egyptian slave, is not without purpose for the Jewish reader, who is thus thematically prepared for the same choice of words, again in an Egyptian context of slavery, in Exodus. But this is not all, as we will soon see. Up until now, we have neglected one apparently dissonant instance in Genesis in which God is recorded to be seen. Genesis 9. God makes a covenant with Noah, with his offspring, and with every living being that never again shall be a flood to destroy the earth. And God sets the rainbow in the clouds as the sign of the covenant. But here comes the significant part. God promises that when the bow is in the clouds, I will see and remember the eternal covenant between God and every living being of all flesh that is on the earth. God commits himself to see and remember. Why is this significant? Apparently, this instance of God's seeing does not totally fit either with God evaluating the moral quality of his creation or with God's care for the afflicted. Then how are we to interpret it in light of our arguments so far? As we just mentioned, we are soon to move on from Genesis and be facing the narrative of Exodus. And it is important at this moment to keep in mind some of the most essential key phrases that marked our God-seeing narratives in Genesis so far. These are our literary pieces of puzzle. A cry going up to God in the Sodom and Gomorrah story. God hearing the cry. Hagar, Sodom and Gomorrah stories. God knowing, Sodom and Gomorrah story. God coming down, the story of Tower of Babel. God seeing the afflicted, stories of Hagar, Leah, and Jacob. God remembering his covenant, the story of Noah and the flood. In Genesis, God seeing is in tight connection with God hearing, God remembering, God knowing, and God coming down. Here is how this becomes significant in light of Israel's greatest story of judgment and redemption. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. It seems that all the separate themes of God seeing in Genesis were foreshadowing a narrative greater than them all that now includes them all, the narrative of the Exodus. God taking his people out of Egypt. Even more, just a few verses later, God himself describes this Exodus narrative to Moses using the same God-seeing thematic echoes from Genesis. I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, because I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them. The narrative of God seeing in Israel's liberation from Egypt in Exodus encompasses the essential key phrases related to God seeing in the Genesis narratives. There is no other place in Scripture that I know of where all these pieces of puzzle come together in such a way. From a literary point of view, we thus conclude that the God-seeing narratives in Genesis have foreshadowed the greatest narrative in Israel's ancient history, a narrative of God manifesting both his judgment and his redemptive care for the afflicted, the Exodus. The purpose of this paper was to survey all the instances in which God is recorded to be seeing, verb ra, in the book of Genesis, and we have proposed a twofold thesis as a result of this study. First, we argued that the main two reasons for which God is recorded to be seeing in Genesis are to evaluate the moral quality of his creation, especially humans, and judge it accordingly, and to care for the afflicted and intervene in their situation in a redemptive manner. In short, in Genesis God sees to bring about his judgment and or to manifest his care. For the second facet of our thesis, we argued that all the instances in which God is recorded to be seeing in Genesis represent literary pieces of puzzle that foreshadow and come together in the core of the Exodus narrative, the greatest story of God's manifesting judgment and redemptive care for the afflicted in Israel's ancient history. We have found this study of God seeing in Genesis to carry a deep meaning for us as Christians today as well. Knowing that we are seen by God should motivate us to cultivate the fear of God more, because of his supreme authority to morally evaluate and judge us. God still is the righteous judge. But it should also inspire us to rest assured in knowing that he cares for us, and that he is ready to intervene in our affliction in a redemptive manner. God still is in the business of caring for his people. Thank you. If there are any questions or comments, I will do my best to address them. Yes.
Thank you. That was a very good paper. Enjoyed that. I noticed you quoted Sarna in here about the Tower of Babel narrative, God descending, coming down to see what's going on. And I think his wording is a little too kind. I think this is just a polemic against the people building that tower, showing the utter futility of trying to reach God. God doesn't need to come down to see what's going on. It's almost he's belittling them. I've got to go down and see what's going on way down there, you know. But it's an interesting, that whole narrative, of course, the play on words is brilliant. But I just wanted to mention, we had a student up at Andrews University who's blind and did a PhD dissertation on theology of blindness, which I think would be very interesting, possibly of interest to you. But I'm thinking, God's not blind. God, always sees, but what happens when he can't? And I think that the idea of God hiding his face, a motif in the Old Testament where he turns away, that's when he will not see, he will not allow himself to see this, or whatever. But interesting. Appreciate your work.
Thank you for sharing. Yes, definitely a subject to look into, because as humans we do feel the need to be seen.
Yeah,
that communicates so much to us. And when God chooses, or we think God chooses not to see, that's when the struggle comes up. So,
Well, I really appreciate this. I just finished doing some studying the book of Exodus, Women's Bible study. But some time ago, my pastor, then pastor, said to several of us, you know what I need to do? I ought to just come in on Sunday morning and say, you're up to preach. And it did instill the fear in me. So I went home that day and I was working in Exodus. And God sees, God cares, and God will act. That's always the impression I got. So thank you for, providing the exegetical word to the original language, because this idea of God seeing and why that is important is another layer. But just the idea of this, the story of Exodus, how important it is, how God always identifies, don't forget me, I'm the one who brought you out, and how often that's repeated, On a human level, we'd be like, you have to remind me of that all the time. Along with so many other wonderful things, but thank you so much, because this really is an encouragement to me to continue to do further studies in the book of Exodus. I find myself just overwhelmed at how important the book is, like on so many levels. I also find in reading the Gospel of John, I've walked away thinking, there's a lot of that, God. Seeing, there's a lot of it also in the Gospel of John, but just wonderful paper.
Thank you for your encouragement. Yes.
Great paper, enjoyed it. I look forward to plagiarizing it. Good stuff in here. As you're reading, I'm curious if you have ever explored ancient Near Eastern God language that has seeing and hearing and coming down and all these same sort of things. I don't know, but it seems like those same sort of verbs would be in some of the creation myths, although the difference is the gods don't care and don't redeem, they come down and slaughter the humans because they're making too much noise or something. So I just think that would be a wonderful, if you write this paper larger, it would be a wonderful, section to include, how do the ancient Near Eastern gods see and hear? What's the result of that?
Yes, that's wonderful. I did not study that, but I think it's a wonderful continuation of this. And I do intend to hopefully make it, to develop it, and that's a great point to study. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Yes.
Another thing that occurred to me was instances of God not knowing the wicked. It's interesting. So Jesus says, he'll say, "Depart from me, I never knew you." There's contrast, like the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish, seeming to imply he knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked, he just doesn't have knowledge somehow. And I thought it was interesting that you connected the knowing with sort of caring and more of sort of having a relationship or something, because I always thought it's odd that there's passages that seem to say God just doesn't have knowledge about something, but maybe it's, I just wonder if you had any thoughts about that, whether there's maybe a connection between those and God's lack of relationship to some people or something.
Well, that is it's a point that that's a good food for thought.
Yeah.
I wouldn't venture myself to say that I could interpret that, but thank you for sharing that. I think it is my kind of started from God seeing, and then I got to God knowing. So that's just a ramification of, as far as I could notice in Genesis, from God seeing, God also manifests knowledge. But I think that's a great theme to explore. Yeah, because knowing has a relational aspect to it as well, because God doesn't need to know as if he needs to acquire information and then he just doesn't know about what the evil persons do. So it's
certainly in the Hebrew, that
yes.
knowledge is more than just kind of
Right.
intellectual.
Right, so that's
Did you see a connection between Genesis 22 and Abraham calling that place the Lord sees?
yes, the Lord will see to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about it. The reason I didn't include it in my paper is because I was looking specifically for the limits that I had, just for, how should I say, just for those acts of God seeing that actually have a target, I don't know, a real target. It felt, as I was reading, I'm open to learning more about this. It felt like where Moses says God will see to it is more like an idiom type of language that doesn't necessarily has a, I couldn't say, what did that mean for God to see the lamb or the ram that was supposed to be provided there. So I don't know if this makes sense. I kind of looked at only stories in which God seeing a target, God seeing something is very clear as an act of God. So in that situation I kind of had questions, and of course it's open for more study, if that's more like an idiomatic use in which Moses says, God will see to it, or it's really God's act of seeing something. So, but I was thinking about that right before coming in this door. I thought, what if someone asks me? but that was the reason why I didn't include it in the paper. But thank you. It's a good place to explore as well. Sure.
Just another suggestion to, if you're interested to look into. I came to this thing because I did a dissertation largely about Gregory of Nyssa, and he has this whole thing about how it's a bad etymology, but he says that theos in Greek is connected to sight, and that he thinks that that the word God doesn't even really predicate the divine nature of a thing. It really predicates this activity of seeing. And he goes into all this about how God beholds and sees everything. And at first I kind of thought, well, whatever, that's a, interesting idea, but I kind of thought about this too. I thought, well, in the Old Testament, prophets kind of invoke God by saying, behold, and that there is this kind of, and the first, I thought about Hagar, but this really kind of opened my eyes to, there's a huge theme in Genesis and Exodus, so maybe it makes some more sense to think that God, even maybe the idea of divinity is connected somehow with beholding. I thought that was a fascinating thing for me to have to think about.
Sure. Thank you for mentioning that. I think also the pattern that I noticed with God seeing, God acting, is God is never a spectator, so that already communicates something about God's involvement. It's part of God's nature to be involved with us and what happens to us. So maybe there is a connection.
Yeah.
I think we only have 2 more minutes, but if there's, no more comments or questions. We'll end our evening here. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.